Okay, this is Marine Biology Module 8, and this chapter is on marine ecology. So as we begin our discussion of marine ecology, we've got to define some terms. So let's start by defining what ecology is. So ecology is the study of organisms and how they interact with their environment. And more specifically, we're interested in how marine organisms interact in the marine environment. Two terms that so obviously the environment includes both living and non-living things. So we use different terms. For something that is living, we use the term biotic, and for non-living, we use the term abiotic. So a means not, so not, and biotic means living, so not living. And therefore, when we talk about a habitat of an organism, we're talking about where does an organism live. And it includes both the biotic and the abiotic components of where that organism lives. So it could include trees, but it also would include water or rocks that are non-living parts of that habitat. Some other terms that we will be using, so we need to define them so that we're all on the same page as we use them. So when we talk about ecology, a population are groups or members of the same species that live together. So we wouldn't talk about when we use the term population, like if we say the population of Brownsburg, Indiana, we would only talk about the population of dogs or the population of deer or the population of people, but we wouldn't talk about them all together if we're talking about population. So population is only the same species together. And then in a community is a group of populations. So a community would include different species because we're grouping together or we're bringing together groups of populations. And then the last one that we would talk about would be an ecosystem. And an ecosystem would be a group of communities. And and this would include their physical environment. So in other words, we're looking at both the living and the non-living in a given location. So the ecosystem, I mean, the ecosystem can be defined as a smaller area or a very large area, but where it's going to be, however you define that, it's going to be the living and the non-living in a given area. So it should be clear to you that in terms of the numbers of organisms, a population would be the smallest, community gets larger, and then an ecosystem is even larger, and it encompasses the physical environment as well. When we begin to talk about ecology and ecosystems, one of the things that has to be addressed is population growth. And so what we're interested in is, will a population grow or will it be wiped out? And what factors influence in that? So what are some things that affect population growth that could be clues of whether a population will grow or whether it will be wiped out? So here's some of the things that affect that. One is nutrition, nutrients. Are there enough nutrients to feed the population? If there is, then that population will probably thrive. If there isn't, then you're going to get a decrease in the population, and if the nutrient supply is not remedied, then the population would die out. Changes in temperature can affect population growth. This would include changes in, like, seasonal changes, but also changes in weather that could impact the ability of populations to grow and survive. Specifically in a marine environment, we are interested in changes in salinity. So anything that leads to changes in salinity could affect the ability of a population to grow. Also, again, with regard to marine currents, and this is especially important because currents will move nutrients in and out. And we've just seen that nutrients obviously affect the ability of a population to grow. Storms can affect the ability of things to grow. I erase these ones on the top and add some more. Another factor that affects population growth is oil spills or other environmental ramifications on a marine environment. Predators. How do the predator-prey relationships bear out? And then the last one I will mention is competition. And when in terms of competition, we would be interested in, so there might be different species competing for food. Or another type of competition would be competing for space. So if it's too crowded, then you're going to get some of the things that will happen if it's too crowded is, eventually you're going to get a lot of waste build up, and that can cause the spread of disease. So there in a marine environment, as in any environment, there can be competition between organisms, and that will affect population growth. So with those factors in mind, we talk about a concept that is called carrying capacity. And carrying capacity simply states how large of a population can be supported by an area with the resources that are available. So, for example, Eagle Creek Park here in Indianapolis, you could think about that as, so think about the resources that are available within Eagle Creek Park, and let's think about white-tailed deer. We know there are a lot of deer that live in White Creek Park. Well, how many white-tailed deer can live in Eagle Creek Park with the resources that are available? And if the white-tailed deer population is allowed to continue to multiply, and there's no hunting or anything to decrease the number, then is it possible that the carrying capacity for white-tailed deer in Eagle Creek Park could be exceeded? So just based on primarily on the food that is available, how many white-tailed deer can be supported within Eagle Creek Park. So resources are needed to live, and if a needed resource is not available, then that population is not going to be able to continue to multiply, continue to reproduce, and survive. And so kind of related to the carrying capacity is something called the limiting resource. So if something is required for population growth, that is a limiting resource. So for example, let's say that for a certain animal to live in an area, that animal needs to have access to a certain plant that it gets a certain nutrient from. Well, if that plant is in limited supply, if there's only a small amount of it, that plant is going to limit the ability of that animal to grow in population or to maintain a certain population, because that plant is required for population growth of that particular animal. Okay, so that's a limiting resource. Another term is self-regulating population. And this term, it means what it says. It says that a population will limit its population growth. So let's say that a population gets too big. And there are not, now it's so big that there are not enough resources for it. Then what will happen? Organisms will compete for the resources that are available. And the ones that get the resources survive, the other ones die. So that is a way of self-regulating the population. It gets too big, and then there is a correction to bring that population back to the other size. So this can occur between, this competition can be within a species, or it can be between different species. So you can have the same species competing for resources, or you can have different species competing for the same resources. Okay, one other term before we switch gears here, and we'll have most of our terms defined then. The term niche. This refers to everything about an organism's lifestyle. So this would include like its eating habits, the space where it lives. It would include stuff about its reproduction and other behaviors. So ecologists talk about all of these factors that can affect an organism, because what that allows them to do then is to study how can changes in any of these things affect the organism. So the niche of an organism is just basically everything about that organism that allows it to live and to survive and to see population growth. Okay. Also, then another, we've kind of alluded to this already in terms of competition, but another aspect of ecology are the predator-prey relationships. I'm sure you are familiar with the terms predator and prey, but just so we're all on the same page. So a predator eats another organism. And the prey is that which is eaten by the predator. So obviously, when we start talking about population, what's eating and what's getting eaten is going to affect the population. So we have to look at those relationships between predator and prey. And in addition to one thing eating, in addition to the predator-prey relationship where one thing is eating another and that affects the population, there are other types of relationships that are important in looking at an ecosystem. And the term that we use for this is symbiosis. So what this looks at relationships between organisms. And so we will talk about a host, and then we'll also talk about the symbiont. So the host, in looking at the relationship between organisms, the host is usually the larger. You're looking at two organisms and a relationship between them. The host is usually the larger of those two, and then the symbiont would be the smaller of the two. So there's different types of relationships. One is called commensalism. And in commensalism, one benefits and one is not affected. So last week in our last module, we talked about the whale lice, those lice that live on the patches of skin on a whale. As far as we know right now, the lice benefit from that because they consume the dead skin and other plankton and things like that that live on the whale. And as far the best we know now is the whale's not affected one way or the other. There have been some studies that have shown that perhaps it's beneficial to the whale because it apparently when a whale is being attacked or approached by a predator, the whale will often put near the predator that the side that is covered in this lice. So there is a question of whether that provides some protection for the whale, but for the most part, it's viewed as commensalism, where the lice benefit, and it just doesn't have any effect on the whale. So that's an example of commensalism. Another example of relationship between organisms that we've already looked at is a parasite. So I won't say a lot about that. So usually in a parasitic relationship, it's usually long-standing. So it's not something that happens for just a short period of time. And in a parasitic relationship, one feeds on the other. So we looked at tapeworm. So the way that tapeworms can grow to be so large is because if they're not treated, they will live in an organism for a long time. So it's a long-standing relationship. So obviously in a parasitic relationship, one benefits, the other is harmed because one feeds on the other. Okay, and then perhaps one of the most fascinating of these is mutualism. And in mutualism is a relationship where both benefit. And not only may they both benefit, but it's possible that this relationship may require each other in order to survive. Okay, so in the marine environment, there are a number of different examples of mutualism, and we'll look at some videos here. The first one I will mention is the clownfish and the sea anemone. And in this mutualistic relationship, so sea anemones have these tentacles that will, if you brush up against them, they will, you'll get a toxin. But the clownfish is able to live and swim among those tentacles without it. It's coated. The clownfish has a mucus covering that protects it from the toxin release from the sea anemone. And so the clownfish is able to be protected from predators because it can swim among the sea anemones. And the sea anemone benefits because with the clownfish darting in and out among it, it will draw other fish into the sea anemone that the sea anemone can then eat. So let me show you a quick little video of the sea anemone and the clownfish. Okay, so that's all we really needed to see. There was you can see the sea anemone swimming. I'm sorry, the clownfish swimming among the sea anemone. Okay, then another symbiotic relationship is between a blind shrimp and a goby fish. So the blind fish, as its name implies, doesn't see very well, and yet it lives in a burrow in the sand. And as you can imagine, the water is constantly washing away, washing into the hole or the burrow, and so the blind shrimp has to constantly be digging, and yet it doesn't see very well, so it can't see when predators are approaching. So that's where the goby fish comes in. The goby fish will basically stands guard, and it keeps the shrimp actually kind of keeps contact with the goby fish, and then if a predator is coming, the goby fish will alert the shrimp, and they will both scurry into the hole. So the blind shrimp benefits from the goby fish protecting it from predators, and then the goby fish lives in the hole that the goby fish has built. So we'll watch a video here of that.
Another goby and another strategy. A shrimp dug his burrow and still lives here, cleaning out the sand. The shrimp has poor eyesight and relies on the goby as a guard. There's a tenderness between this odd couple. The shrimp always has a tentacle touching the goby, and the goby warns the shrimp with flicks of his fins. A Sohal surgeonfish passes. The goby pushes the shrimp down the burrow. The hard-working housekeeper rarely goes out. Instead, it removes. A shrimp dug his burrow, a strategy. Another.
Okay, so that is the relationship between the shrimp, the blind shrimp, and the goby fish. And then the last one that we will look at is the relationship between the relationship between the Oriental sweetlip, which is a type of fish, and a fish that is called a blue wrasse. And so, like many fish, the Oriental sweetlips has teeth, and those teeth get dirty with debris from what the fish has been eating. And so what happens is the blue wrasse will swim into the mouth of the Oriental sweetlips and clean its teeth. So the Oriental sweetlip benefits by having its teeth cleaned, and the blue wrasse benefits because it gets food. So let's watch a video of this relationship. Okay, so again, that's enough of that. Just that you can see the relationship between the blue wrasse and the Oriental sweetlips. Now, what we've looked at here, we've looked at like individual, like the clownfish and the sea anemone, so two organisms. But mutualism can also exist where there are many organisms involved in a mutual relationship. So, for example, there's a certain type of coral that can harbor and protect up to 16 different species of crabs, fish, shrimp, and then so the coral protects these guys, but then at the same time, these organisms will protect the coral from predators. So, when we talk about mutualistic relationships, it doesn't have to be just relationships between two organisms. It can be a whole group of organisms, or within a certain ecosystem that you see a larger mutualistic relationship. Okay, some of this will be review from biology, but we also have to talk about the tropic relationships between organisms within an ecosystem. So here, as you know, we talk about producers, we talk about consumers, but usually we talk about primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers, and there can even be higher levels than that, but we'll only go this far. So a producer obviously is a plant that, or algae or something that makes its own energy. A primary consumer is an organism that eats producers. A secondary consumer eats primary consumers. And a tertiary consumer is one that eats secondary consumers. So for example, so a mouse, so a plant is growing, so that's a producer, and then a mouse eats the plant, so the mouse would be a primary consumer, and then a hawk eats the mouse, so then the hawk in that case would be the secondary consumer. And organisms can be more than, so an organism could be a secondary consumer and also a tertiary consumer. So these get a little more complicated than, so we could look at something like a simple food chain. So you have a plant, kelp, that is eaten by the sea urchins. So this would be the primary consumer. The sea urchins would be the primary consumer. So these would be primary consumer. And then the sea otter eats the sea urchin, so that would be a secondary consumer. And then the shark eats the sea otter, so the shark would be the tertiary consumer. So this is a simple food chain. However, it's usually a lot more complicated than that because of the relationship between different organisms. So a better way of drawing it is something more like this, where this is called a food web, and it better shows the relationships between different organisms within an ecosystem, and in this case, a coral reef ecosystem. I guess that's all we will say about that. In terms of looking at the energy within an ecosystem, what we look at is something called primary productivity. And all that means is that we just look at how much photosynthesis is done within an ecosystem, because since all of the energy within an ecosystem can be traced back to the plants, because the plants make the energy, and then something eats the plants, and then something eats that, and something eats that. But ultimately, it can all be traced back to the rate of photosynthesis. And so if we want to look at the energy within an ecosystem, we look at photosynthesis, because photosynthesis is what provides the energy for the ecosystem. So as you know, photosynthesis is where we take carbon dioxide and water, and that gets converted into sugars plus oxygen, right? And these sugars are carbohydrates, and that's the basic chemical formula for carbohydrates are C6H12O6. So some of that should at least look familiar to you from biology or chemistry. But basically, what we are doing is we're taking the carbon that is in carbon dioxide, so this is a gas, and we're converting that carbon. What photosynthesis is doing is it's converting that carbon into another form. And why is that important? Well, we can't use carbon dioxide gas for energy, but this does provide energy. So that is why photosynthesis is so important, is that it's taking a form of carbon that isn't useful to the ecosystem and converting it into a form that will provide energy. And then, other organisms, then, we eat these plants, and then something eats those plants, and then something else eats that. So other organisms eat these, and they get their carbon. So this whole thing is called the carbon cycle. So in the carbon cycle, you're taking carbon in the form of CO2, and you are converting that into carbohydrates or sugars, and then other organisms eat those. And then how does it all get returned back to the system? Well, then remember, there are also decomposers in this system that then take waste or take dead things, and they recycle that carbon back to CO2. So let's look. I want to look at a picture of the carbon cycle that shows all this. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so we'll start here in the middle. And so here in the middle, so carbon dioxide gets in the marine environment, the carbon dioxide gets dissolved in water. So here we have the carbon dioxide that is dissolved in water. Then through photosynthesis, these plants take that carbon dioxide, or through photosynthesis, these plants take the CO2 and they convert it into carbohydrates. So that's what's happening here. So here we have our carbohydrates or sugars. Well, then what happens to those? Well, herbivores eat those. So sea urchins or certain types of fish that are herbivores eat those. And then because there are predators, then the sharks or other larger fish will eat these. So that the energy that was in those carbohydrates is getting passed up through the food web. And then these animals are going to excrete waste, or they're going to die, or these will die. And then that gives us waste and dead organic matter. Well, then what happens? The decomposers come in, and they, through the process of decomposition, that you get the carbon dioxide back, and the whole thing starts again. And then this here is showing that the plants can also die, and when they die, so this, if the plant dies, and it doesn't get consumed, then it also will be recycled by these decomposers, and you get the carbon dioxide back again. So it's a cycle where we start with carbon dioxide. That carbon dioxide gets converted to carbohydrates through photosynthesis, and then those plants are eaten by different organisms. Those organisms secrete waste, and that waste is then recycled back to carbon dioxide by things like bacteria or other decomposers. Okay, so the carbon cycle is really important for a marine ecosystem. Okay, and then another cycle that is really important for, besides the carbon cycle, another cycle that is really important for the marine ecosystem is the nitrogen cycle. And you might ask, well, why is nitrogen important for an ecosystem? Well, nitrogen is in DNA and also in amino acids. And as you might remember, amino acids make up protein. So obviously DNA and protein are necessary for living organisms. So just like we said that carbon is trapped in carbon dioxide, a gas, nitrogen also occurs in a gas. So about more than 80% of the air that we breathe is nitrogen, and it's in the form of a gas. But nitrogen gas cannot be used by most organisms. So they need this nitrogen for DNA and for making proteins, so having amino acids to make proteins, but in the form of nitrogen gas, it can't be used. So then we have a process that is called nitrogen fixation, which I think we've already talked about a little bit in here, but I'm going to show you a figure that illustrates it. So let's see. This figure illustrates the nitrogen cycle. So as I said, most of the nitrogen, the nitrogen in the air is in the form of nitrogen gas, which is N2. So what happens in nitrogen fixation is that, in this case, again, it's bacteria that is doing the job. So bacteria take that nitrogen gas and they convert it into nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. Okay, so what happens in nitrogen fixation is you take nitrogen gas and bacteria convert that into nitrites, nitrites, and ammonia. So all of these contain nitrogen in a form that organisms can use. And so if we go back to our figure then, so here's the bacteria, and it converts this nitrogen gas into these nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia. And then it's similar to the cycle we saw with carbon. Those the plants will use the nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, and then the plants get eaten by primary consumers, and then those get eaten by other larger organisms, and then these eliminate waste or they die. And when they do that, then bacteria and other decomposers decompose it, and you end up back with, you can end up back with nitrogen gas, or you can end up back with nitrates, nitrites, and ammonia, so that everything gets recycled. Okay, so in other words, you start with nitrogen gas, and the nitrogen gas gets converted into a form that organisms can use, and then when that gets passed through the food web, as one thing is eating another, and then when death and waste get decomposed by bacteria, then that nitrogen gets returned to the cycle, returned to the ecosystem. Okay, so that is the nitrogen cycle. Okay, then the last thing that we need to talk about for this module is just looking at a figure that lists different areas of the ocean ecosystem. So we refer to these as environmental zones. And we'll put up a picture here in a minute, but a couple terms I want to introduce first. So the first is called the photic zone. And so photic means light, like we get our word photograph from that, or photon is a packet of light. And so any area where light can penetrate would be called the photic zone. So light can penetrate. And so if light is penetrating, we know that photosynthesis is taking place there. Okay, and then the opposite of the photic region is the aphotic region. So the aphotic zone, so again, A means no light, so this would be an area where there is little or no light, and therefore no photosynthesis. So as you might imagine, these would be areas with greater depth because the light cannot penetrate. So let's look at this figure. So now in terms of the photic zone and the aphotic zone, we're looking at depth. So here down to this depth, light can penetrate and photosynthesis could take place, and then below that, this area here is called the aphotic zone or aphotic zone because the depth is too great for light to penetrate and photosynthesis would not take place. Okay, so then the second thing we need to look at, so within the photic zone, then we're really talking about three things. We're talking about the splash zone, the intertidal zone, and the inner shelf. So let's define those. So within the photic zone, so the photic zone would include the intertidal zone. So the intertidal zone, intertidal, it's within the tide. So this area is where this area is exposed at low tide and it's covered at high tide. We'll look at our picture again in a minute. Covered at high tide. And then also in the photic zone would be the splash zone. And the splash zone is always above water. However, it gets sprayed, so it gets splashed. So, but it does get gets a salt spray. Let's say that. And then lastly is the inner shelf, and that it's at the edge, but it's an area where light can penetrate. Okay, so we can look at our picture then again of these three zones. So you can see the splash zone here. So it's always out of the water, but it will get some, it's going to get splashed by that salt water. The intertidal zone here, so when the tide is high, it's going to be covered up. When the tide is low, it's going to be exposed. And then the inner shelf is just this first area that's always underwater, but the depth is such that light can penetrate it and photosynthesis can take place. Okay, then a couple other areas that we'll talk about. We'll talk about the bathyl and abyssal zones. Let's go back to our whiteboard. So the bathyl zone let me go back and say, so now we're in the abiotic area. So the abiotic would include the bathyl zone. So the bathyl zone is where you drop down to the deep ocean. So drop down to the deep ocean. And then we've seen some of this before in the first module, I think. The abyssal zone is the plains of the deep ocean, the flat area. And then the hadal zone are the trenches of the deep ocean. So the deep ocean trenches. RE. Okay, so again, we can go back to our figure. And so here is the bathyl zone where you drop off to the deep ocean. Then the abyssal zone is the deep ocean plain. And then when you get a trench, that is the hadal zone. Okay, and then just a few other terms that we need to be aware of with regard to marine life. So the term benthic is used to refer to those things that live on the ocean floor. And then the term pelagic refers to those things that live away from the ocean bottom. And then in terms of the pelagic, then we use the term neritic. And these are things that live near the shore. And oceanic refers to those things that that live in other areas of the ocean. So they're not bottom dwellers like these things that live on the ocean floor, but these are live in other areas away from the shore. Okay, that's neritic and oceanic. And then two other terms are whether something is nekton or plankton. So something that is nekton is something that's able to swim against the currents. So most fishes would be nekton. And then plankton are things that just move with the currents. Okay, so they're not able to swim against the currents, so they just get carried along with the ocean currents. Okay, so we'll do. I'd like to do some. If we look at On Your Own 8.11, I'd like to look at some of these. So, like if we had deep water sharks, what are some terms? How could we describe deep water sharks? Okay, well, we would say that they live on the outer shelf of the ocean. And we would say that they live in the bathyl zone. Okay, so if we go back to our picture here. Okay, so sharks live here. And they also, so since they're deep ocean sharks, they live here, but then they could also live here. Okay, and then other terms that we might use for sharks, we would say that they, most of them are pelagic, and they are nektonic. They're nektons because they are able to swim against the ocean current. Okay, what if we were to look at shorebirds? Where do shorebirds live? Well, if we look at our figure, so shorebirds, they don't live in the water, so they could live in this intertidal zone that sometimes is covered with the water during high tide, and then they also would probably also live within the splash zone. Okay, what about sponges? Where would we say sponges live? What would we say about sponges? Okay, so sponges, we would say, sponges do photosynthesis. Some of them do photosynthesis. So, but they also had to be covered with water. Okay, so the sponges would need to live in this inner shelf area because they need to be covered with water. But they also need the penetration of light. Okay, how about autotrophic bacteria? So autotrophic bacteria means that they, since they're autotrophic, they make their own food, but bacteria don't use light to make their own food. They use chemical sediment. So where would you find chemical sediment Well, you would find it on the ocean bottom, so you would find it in a aphotic region, and so you would find these in the abyssal plain. Okay, so again, looking at our figure, they would be here, and anywhere in this aphotic region, although probably not in the trenches, but in the abyssal area. And then, okay, I guess that's all for that. We can also then talk about whether organisms are benthic or pelagic. Benthic or pelagic. P-E. So a sea urchin, we would say, is benthic. A yellow jackfish we would say is pelagic. And what we would also say about this is that it's a nekton, so it's able to swim against the current. Coral is benthic. So coral lives on the ocean floor. Diatoms, well, diatoms would be pelagic. They don't live on the ocean floor. They live away from the ocean floor. And then we would also say that these are plankton. They're not able to swim against the currents. Stingray is benthic. And then lastly, a jellyfish. What do we say about a jellyfish? Well, they are pelagic because they don't live on the ocean floor. And then the other thing that we would say about them is they're plankton. The jellyfish are not able to swim against the currents. They drift along with the currents. They don't swim against them. Okay, so that finishes up all of the information in Module 8 for marine biology.